She was everything her parents had ever dreamed of. Straight A's, piano lessons, figure skating, a scholarship to university, a daughter who never went to parties, never broke curfew, never caused a single moment of worry. By every measure that mattered to her family, Jennifer Pan was perfect. But on the night of November 8, 2010, three armed men walked through the front door of a quiet house in Markham, Ontario. They took her parents to the basement, and they shot them both in the head. Jennifer was found upstairs, tied to a banister with a shoelace, completely unharmed. She told police she had no idea who the men were. She told them it was a random home invasion. She cried. She cooperated. She played the role of a traumatized, grieving daughter with convincing precision. But here is the thing about a life built entirely on lies. Eventually, one small detail unravels everything. The father she thought was dead woke up from his coma. And the first thing Han Pan told police was that he had seen his daughter whispering to one of the hitmen. Not screaming, not struggling, whispering, calmly, like she knew exactly who he was. What came next would shock an entire country, captivate millions of people around the world, and raise a question that nobody could fully answer. How does a daughter who appeared to have everything become the person who ordered her own parents killed? And even more disturbing, how did she hide an entirely different life from the two people who knew her better than anyone? This is the story of Jennifer Pan, and nothing about it is what it appears to be. To understand what Jennifer Pan did, you first have to understand the world she was raised in. Her parents, Han and Bitch Pan, were not ordinary immigrants. They were survivors. They had fled Vietnam as refugees in 1979, arriving in Canada with almost nothing, speaking almost no English, and building an entirely new life through sheer relentless work. Han became a tool and die maker. Bitch worked on an assembly line making car parts. They saved carefully, moved into a modest home in Markham, a suburb northeast of Toronto with a large East Asian community, and devoted every spare moment to making sure their children would never have to struggle the way they had. Jennifer was their eldest. Born in 1986, she was placed into piano lessons at 12, enrolled in figure skating, trained in martial arts, and expected to maintain near-perfect grades at all times. She was not allowed to attend school dances, not allowed to go to parties, not allowed to have a boyfriend until she had established herself academically. Her parents did not see these rules as restrictions. They saw them as protection, as love expressed in the only language they knew. And for a long time, Jennifer seemed to embrace it. She was charming, warm, and effortlessly likable. Teachers adored her. Neighbors respected the family. She was, by all external appearances, exactly what her parents believed her to be, a golden child on a clear path toward a successful future. But underneath that polished surface, something was quietly fracturing. In 11th grade, Jennifer met a boy named Daniel Wong. He was a year older, confident, a little rebellious, everything her controlled world was not. She fell for him immediately. And for the first time in her life, she had something her parents had never approved of, never even known about. A secret. When Daniel was forced to transfer schools after police found marijuana in his car, Jennifer's carefully maintained grades began to slip. The A's she had always delivered dropped to B's. And then something happened that changed everything. She failed calculus in her senior year, and the university admission she had already been offered was withdrawn. Jennifer Pan did not tell her parents. Instead, she forged the paperwork. She created fake report cards. She invented a story about deferring her enrollment and starting the following semester. And her parents, who trusted her completely, believed every word. That was the first lie. But it was far from the last. For the next several years, Jennifer Pan constructed an entirely parallel existence. She told her parents she was attending university. Every single morning, she left the house as if she were heading to class. But she never arrived anywhere near a lecture hall. She spent her days in coffee shops, in Daniel's dorm room, wandering through shopping centers, anywhere that was not home. She forged transcripts. She fabricated grade reports. She even invented a graduation ceremony, producing a fake diploma that her father proudly displayed. Then she went further. She told them she had been accepted into the University of Toronto's pharmacy program. She invented volunteer work at the hospital for sick children. She created fake pay stubs from a pharmacy where she supposedly worked. Her parents celebrated each achievement. Her father bought her a laptop as a gift for the scholarship he believed she had earned. He bragged to relatives about his remarkable daughter, the pharmacist. None of it was real. Not a single credential. Not a single shift worked. For nearly a decade, Jennifer Pan lived two entirely separate lives simultaneously and kept them from colliding through an almost unimaginable level of sustained deception. But here is where the story takes its first sharp turn. All of this, the fake degrees, the fabricated career, the invented life, was not originally about escaping her parents. It was about avoiding a conversation she was terrified to have. She didn't want to disappoint them. She didn't want to see the look on their faces when they found out she had failed. And so she lied once, and then again, and again, until the lie was so enormous and so deeply embedded that she couldn't imagine a path back to the truth. Psychologists have a term for this pattern. They call it a snowball lie, a deception that begins small and then grows so large that dismantling it feels more dangerous than continuing to maintain it. Jennifer was trapped inside a fiction of her own making, and the longer it went on, the more desperately she needed to keep it intact. What she didn't fully reckon with was this: her parents were not going to stay in the dark forever. And when the truth finally came out, the consequences would be far worse than anything she had feared. For years, Jennifer Pan maintained her double life with remarkable discipline. But by 2010, the architecture of her deception was showing serious cracks. The relationship with Daniel Wong had evolved significantly over the years. They had stayed close even as the initial teenage romance cooled, and by 2010, they were deeply reconnected, exchanging daily messages, making plans, quietly building toward a future together. Daniel was dealing marijuana and managing a local Boston pizza franchise. He was not the kind of partner Jennifer's parents would ever approve of. But at this point, that almost didn't matter. Jennifer was 24 years old. She had been living a lie for nearly a decade, and she had started to believe that the only way out was forward, with Daniel away from her parents free. Then her parents found out. Exactly how the discovery unfolded is contested in various accounts, but the result was unambiguous. Han and Bitch Pan learned that their daughter had never graduated high school, that she had never attended university, that there was no pharmacy degree, no volunteer work, no career, that the diplomas on the wall were forgeries, that every achievement they had celebrated for the past 8 years had been a fabrication. The confrontation was devastating. Han Pan, a man who had rebuilt his entire life from nothing on the basis of hard work and honesty, was not simply disappointed. He was broken, and his response was immediate and absolute. Jennifer was told she had a choice. She could end her relationship with Daniel Wong completely and permanently, or she could leave the family home. Jennifer chose to stay. She ended contact with Daniel, at least that was what she told her parents. But here is the twist that nobody saw coming. She didn't end the relationship. She went underground with it. She kept 2 phones. One she used for normal communication with her family. The other, a spare iPhone that Daniel had given her, loaded with a separate SIM card, was used exclusively for contact with Daniel. Her parents had no idea it existed. And it was on that second phone, in the weeks that followed the confrontation, that something deeply disturbing began to take shape. Jennifer later claimed in court that her relationship with her father had become unbearable, that the surveillance, the control, the crushing weight of having to rebuild her credibility from zero while living under his roof was more than she could endure. She described her father as the rule maker, authoritarian, cold, impossible to satisfy. She described herself as a woman with no future and no way out. What the evidence showed, however, was something far more calculated than despair. In spring 2010, Jennifer reconnected with a school acquaintance named Andrew Montemayor. During a conversation about difficult parents, she floated a question. Could someone be paid to make a problem disappear? Montemayor introduced her to a man named Ricardo Duncan. Jennifer allegedly paid Duncan $200 to murder her father in a parking lot at his workplace. Duncan took the money. He did not go through with it. But the attempt itself tells you something chilling. This was not an impulsive moment of rage. This was a plan. And when the first plan failed, Jennifer Pan began working on a second one. Through Daniel, she was connected to a man named Linford Crawford. Crawford had connections. He quoted her a price for a contract killing, $20,000, reduced to $10,000 as a professional courtesy to Daniel's circle. Jennifer agreed without hesitation. She calculated that upon her parents' deaths, she would inherit approximately $500,000. She and Daniel would finally be together. The lies would be over. The pressure would be gone. On Halloween night, Crawford visited the Pan family's neighborhood, almost certainly to scout the location. Children in costumes moving through the streets gave him perfect cover. A few days later, he returned with 2 accomplices. The operation was set for the night of November 8, 2010. It was an ordinary Monday evening in a quiet residential street in Markham. Pan and Bitch Pan were at home. Jennifer was also there, as she had been living with her parents since the confrontation earlier that year. From the outside, the house looked like dozens of others on the block. A neat 2-story home, a 2-car garage, the kind of property 2 hardworking people spend a lifetime earning. At some point that evening, 3 men entered the house. This was not a forced entry. There was no sign of the door being broken. The men knew the layout. They knew where to go. Pan and Bitch were taken to the basement. Both were shot in the head and shoulders. Bitch Pan died of her injuries. Pan was shot multiple times but clung to life, eventually being airlifted to a trauma unit at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. Jennifer was found upstairs, tied to the banister with a shoelace, completely unharmed. She told police she had managed to call 911 with her hands bound. She was treated as a victim. She was taken to a hospital for observation. Investigators initially assumed the family's home and perceived wealth had made them a target for a robbery. But something was off from the very beginning. Nothing of value had been taken. The house contained items clearly worth stealing, and they were all untouched. More puzzling, Jennifer Pan appeared physically unharmed in a situation where 2 people had just been shot. And the detail that investigators found most unusual, she had managed to call 911 with her hands tied behind her back, using a phone she claimed to have reached by maneuvering awkwardly. It was possible, but it was strange. Then Pan woke up. He had survived a gunshot wound to the head. He had lost his sight permanently. The bullet had destroyed his vision. But his memory was intact. And when investigators spoke to him in the hospital, he told them something that stopped them cold. He had seen Jennifer whisper to one of the gunmen. Not cry for help. Not scream. Whisper. In a tone that suggested familiarity. That single detail changed everything. Within days, investigators had pulled phone records. They found calls between Jennifer and numbers connected to the men who had entered the house. They found the second phone, the secret iPhone. They found the SIM card. They traced the chain of calls backward through Crawford, back through Daniel Wong, back to Jennifer Pan herself. On November 22, 2010, just 14 days after the shooting, Jennifer Pan was brought in for her 3rd police interview. This time, investigators used a technique permitted in Canada that is not allowed in many other countries. They lied to her. They told her they had evidence they didn't yet have. They told her the case was already built and they simply needed her to fill in the gaps. They told her that cooperating now would matter later. Jennifer Pan began to talk, and once she started, the full architecture of the deception came apart. She confessed to arranging the attack. She insisted it was only supposed to be her father who was killed. She said her mother was never meant to be harmed, that Bitch's death was a terrible accident, a tragic deviation from the plan. She described the chain of connections, the second phone, the negotiations, the price she had agreed to pay. She was arrested that night. So were Daniel Wong, Linford Crawford, David Milvaginam, and a fourth man. All were charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Canadian history. The courtroom proceedings that began in 2014 drew attention not just because of the details of the crime, but because of the human dimensions at the center of it. This was not a story about strangers. This was a story about a family. About a father who had survived being shot by the hitmen his daughter hired, who had lost his wife, who had lost his sight, and who chose to testify against her anyway. Han Pan took the stand and described in quiet, careful detail what he remembered from the night of the attack. He described being taken to the basement. He described the guns. He described the moment he was shot. And he described seeing his daughter's face in the chaos, not the face of a woman being victimized, but the face of someone who knew what was happening and why. The courtroom was silent. Jennifer Pan's defense team argued that she had been mentally fragile, crushed by years of psychological pressure under an oppressively controlling household. They painted a picture of a young woman who had lost her sense of self under the weight of impossible expectations, who had constructed the fake life not out of malice but out of an inability to face her parents' disappointment. They suggested that the plan had been driven largely by Daniel Wong, that Jennifer had been emotionally manipulated, that her culpability was diminished by the circumstances of her upbringing. The prosecution presented a very different portrait. They walked the jury through the timeline of the two separate murder plots, the first in the parking lot that never happened, and the second that did. They presented the phone records, the secret device, the calculated conversations about pricing a contract killing. They pointed out that Jennifer had organized and attended her own mother's funeral, while fully aware that she had hired the men who killed her. They noted that she had been asked to arrange the funeral herself, and had done so. The jury deliberated. In 2015, they returned with their verdict. Jennifer Pan was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Daniel Wong received the same sentence. Linford Crawford and David Milvaginam were also convicted. It appeared to be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Here is where most people think the story ends. A woman lies to her parents for a decade, arranges for them to be murdered, gets caught, goes to prison. Case closed. But the Jennifer Pan case has not ended. And what has happened since the original verdict is arguably more extraordinary than the crime itself. In 2023, Ontario's Court of Appeal made a stunning ruling. It ordered new first-degree murder trials for Jennifer Pan and 3 of her co-accused. The court found that the trial judge had made a legal error. He had presented the jury with only 2 possible versions of events, when the law required him to offer additional options. The appeal court ruled that the jury should have been allowed to consider second-degree murder and manslaughter verdicts in the death of Bitch Pan, not just the binary choice that had been given to them. Because those options were never presented, the conviction was ruled legally unsafe. The decision sent shockwaves through the Canadian legal community. Then, in April 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld that ruling. New trials were ordered. Jennifer Pan, more than a decade after the night her parents were shot, was looking at the possibility of walking back into a courtroom and starting again. And then, in March 2026, something happened that nobody had fully anticipated. Jennifer Pan pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Not first-degree murder. Not second-degree murder. Manslaughter. Her plea was a formal acknowledgement that she had arranged the attack, that her father was an intended target, and that her mother's death had resulted from that arrangement, but not that she had intended for Bitch to die. The prosecution accepted the plea, and with it, Jennifer Pan received a life sentence with a possibility of parole. She will be eligible to apply. The man who carried out the actual shooting, David Milvaganam, was sentenced to life in prison just weeks ago for his role in the plot. As of today, the case that began on a quiet November night in 2010 is still moving through the legal system. The woman who orchestrated it all, who faked a decade of her life, who paid strangers to shoot her parents in their basement, whose father survived and testified against her, is now eligible to one day walk free. Han Pan, who lost his wife, his sight, and the daughter he thought he knew, has never recovered. He could not sell the family home for years because no buyer would purchase it. His son Felix moved across the country to rebuild a life away from the shadow of the case. And Han himself has said simply and painfully that he hopes his daughter will someday become a good and honest person. There are people who watch this story and feel outrage. There are people who feel a complicated, uncomfortable sympathy, not for the crime, but for the crushing environment that Jennifer described, the impossible pressure, the years of living inside a lie with no visible exit. There are people who see a manipulative and calculating killer. There are people who see a deeply troubled young woman who made catastrophic choices under a psychological weight that had been building since childhood. What is certain is this: the people who built a life from nothing, who crossed an ocean as refugees, who worked factory floors for decades to give their children every opportunity they never had. One of them is buried in Markham, Ontario, and the other one is still waiting. The Jennifer Pan case forces us to confront something that makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. The lies didn't start with murder. They started with a failed calculus exam, with a scared teenager who couldn't face her parents' disappointment, chose to hide from it instead. And then one lie became 10, and 10 became 100, and somewhere along the way, something broke in a way that no one, not her parents, not her friends, not even Jennifer herself, fully saw coming. That doesn't excuse what she did. Nothing excuses what she did. A woman is dead. A man lost his sight and his wife and his daughter on the same night. A family was destroyed. But the Jennifer Pan story doesn't let you look away easily, because it doesn't offer a simple villain. It offers something harder, a mirror. A question about pressure and identity, and what happens when someone builds their entire existence around what others need them to be, rather than who they actually are. As of 2026, Jennifer Pan is eligible for parole. Whether she is ever granted it remains to be seen. The legal proceedings for her co-accused are still ongoing, and Han Pan, the man who survived, continues to live with the consequences of a night he will never be able to fully understand. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone. Leave a comment below with what surprised you most about this case. And if you want more stories like this one, true crime with real depth, real stakes, and real consequences, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.